A common argument used to dismiss the Christian Trinity is the observation that the specific word never appears in the text of the Bible. This objection relies on a strict assumption about scriptural literalism. It asserts that for a theological doctrine to be considered authentic and binding, its formalized vocabulary must exist verbatim within the foundational text. If we apply this exact standard of literal, verbatim textual scrutiny to Islam, we have to look directly at its core, non-negotiable concept of monotheism. When we do, we hit a hard textual reality. The word tawhid is entirely absent from the Quran. Demanding that a doctrine's exact vocabulary appear in the primary scripture immediately collapses the theological framework of the critics demanding it. The reality is that major world religions use post-textual vocabulary. They develop later theological terms to summarize, organize, and categorize their early revelations. The massive architecture of modern Islamic doctrine has the Quran as a central hub, surrounded by 20 interconnected doctrinal clusters. We will stress test this structure, systematically stripping away these 20 core doctrines that define orthodoxy today, but are functionally absent from the primary text. Mapping the exact dimensions of this textual gap forces us to reconsider how the religion operates and where its authority actually comes from. The functional, lived foundation of standard Islam does not rest on the isolated text of the Quran. It rests on a massive extra-scriptural tradition. We begin the deconstruction with the most fundamental cluster, the very nature of God and the framework of Islamic belief. Tawhid is not a Quranic word. It is a later technical term developed through kalam. Kalam is the Islamic discipline of seeking theological principles through dialectic debate. The same is true for Aqidah. The Quran never uses the word to mean a structured creed, severing it from the text. Theology also divides God's attributes, or sifat Allah, into specific categories. These divisions don't exist in the text, separating this entire branch. The Quran does mention that God has beautiful names. However, the rigid Asma al-Husna, the formal doctrine capping those names at exactly 99, is an invention of later tradition. Even the massive creedal schools that define modern Sunni orthodoxy, such as Asharism and Maturidism, operate entirely outside the Quranic text. The highly technical vocabulary used to define the Islamic God was historically constructed centuries after the revelation itself. This gap between the text and the tradition is not limited to the nature of God. It directly affects how Islamic truth is transmitted and verified by humans. Take the doctrine of Isma. This is the theological rule stating that prophets cannot commit major sins. It is a crucial component of Islamic epistemology, yet it is never named or explicitly stated in the primary text. Even the term sunnah underwent a major semantic shift. The Quran uses sunnah to describe God's practice. It does not use it as a binding legal term for Muhammad's personal practices. To make sense of the sunnah later, scholars had to construct a massive epistemological filter, the hadith sciences. They developed strict verification terms to grade the reliability of oral traditions. Terms like sahih for authentic, hasan for good, da'if for weak, and mutawatir for widely transmitted. Absolutely none of these essential classifications are Quranic. Without this completely post-Quranic categorization system, standard Islamic jurisprudence would have no mechanism to authenticate its own historical traditions. This lack of explicit textual mechanisms extends directly into the physical and socio-political architecture of the Islamic world, starting here at its geographic epicenter. The Quran uses the term Sharia exactly once, simply meaning a path. It lacks the massive, later juridical sense of a total, comprehensive legal system. The same is true for fiqh. This refers to Islamic jurisprudence, but it never appears in the Quran as a formalized legal discipline. The text uses the verb jihad to mean striving or fighting, but the highly systematized permanent doctrinal category of warfare was developed by later jurists, severing the law and state cluster from the central node. The concept of the Ummah experienced a similar historical shift, moving from multiple loose Quranic meanings into a rigid, global political religious bloc. The comprehensive juridical apparatus regulating the daily lives of Muslims is a product of human systematization, not a direct scriptural mandate. Finally, this deconstruction must cross into the unseen realms: eschatology, the afterlife, and the deep mystical divides within the religion. The Mahdi is the central foundational figure in both Sunni and Shia end times theology, yet the Mahdi is completely unmentioned in the Quran. The text uses the word barzakh to mean a simple physical barrier. The complex doctrinal sense of a purgatory-like waiting state for souls was constructed entirely by later scholars. The Quran briefly mentions a night journey. Over centuries, this reference was expanded into the Miraj, an incredibly detailed theological and visual system mapping the prophet's ascent into heaven. The vast majority of this intricate structural lore and imagery comes strictly from Hadith tradition, not the primary text. The core sectarian divides of the faith suffer the same textual absence. The foundations of Shia Islam, divinely appointed imama, and the infallibility of those imams are nowhere in the text. Within Sufism, the structured mystical frameworks, including tasawwuf and the specific Turuq networks, are highly institutionalized concepts that also developed outside the text. The deepest sectarian, eschatological, and mystical battles in Islamic history are fought over concepts that are entirely missing from its foundational text. Look at the damage of this stress test. 20 structural doctrines have disconnected from the scripture, clustering around a massive new center, later tradition. If that tradition fades to black, the textual baseline is revealed, leaving the central node entirely stranded. Across theology, law, and eschatology, the scale of this scriptural gap is immense. The isolated primary text simply cannot hold up the detailed weight of the massive religion built in its name. A religion structurally dependent on post-scriptural frameworks moves the ultimate burden of legitimacy away from the divine text and places it somewhere else entirely. The true functional pillars of Islamic orthodoxy are human consensus, historical transmission, and dialectical theology, which brings us back to the original paradox. The word not found objection, frequently leveled at Christian theology, insists that validity requires exact textual presence. If strict textual presence is the ultimate measure of doctrinal authenticity, Islam fails its own standard. The institutional structure of modern Islam stands not on a literalist reading of the Quran, but on a massive, precarious post-scriptural engineering project. Mapping this gap is an absolute prerequisite for any rigorous, objective study of Islamic biological authenticity.